Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we're back with another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have a golden age for America, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross post from the economy subreddit, and that's post is Trump's new proposal, 50-year mortgage. How about building more homes and creating a society where people can pay off the debt in 15 years? And then it's a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump, and it's a picture of great American presidents, and it says 30-year mortgage, and it's a picture of FDR, and it says President Roosevelt, and that's 50-year mortgage, and it says a picture of President Trump. And yeah, personally, I think, the libertarian position is, the mortgage scale should be on whatever terms the parties are willing to agree with. There shouldn't be any government mandated how many years it should be. And yeah, I think it's interesting, a lot of conservatives love to say, oh, FDR was one of our worst presidents, but here's Trump praising him. It just goes to show you that, a lot of times conservatism is just progressivism driving the speed limit. Conservatives used to hate FDR, but now that, he's so far in the past, they're starting to say he was a good president because it's a lot like Trump. He used to be a Democrat until 2009, but now he's the Republican vanguard. So it just goes to show you that Republicans are all about moving the goalpost when it comes to conservatism. It's very much like why I'm much more of a libertarian than a conservative. What has conservatism ever conserved? Conservatives are really just progressives from 10 years ago most of the time. And next we have furloughed IRS lawyer opens hot dog stand in D.C. during shutdown, from thedailyrecord.com, posted by Socialists Are Morons. And yeah, that's good. I personally think that goes to show you that we don't even need IRS in the first place. They can obviously start their own businesses if there is ever a government shutdown, and this is a good example as to why. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, I see many right-wing libertarians and conservatives be dismissive of your points when you bring up the fact that the U.S. government and local policies have historically and currently, though implicitly, harmed black people in the U.S., listed by Historical Donut 6758, and they said, what's up with that? You would think more supposed anti-government people would be against these policies, NIMBY laws, redlining laws, occupational licensing laws, monetary inflation, regulatory catch-all regulations, agricultural subsidies, IP laws, the current criminal justice system that promotes overcriminalization, moral hazardous, LLC regulations, etc. They systematically harm black people, but no, you see them promoting all sorts of mental gymnastics to justify the status quo. Again, what's up with that? And I would argue the libertarian perspective is that, the government does do a lot of laws that hurt minorities such as black people, and that's why we should have as less government as possible, because, it's very much like, the government has historically harmed minorities and people of color. Here's why we need the government to fix it. And the problem here is that the government was ever involved in the first place. If they didn't make all these strict redlining laws, for example, then, maybe people would be, maybe there would be less discrimination in the world today. So, it's very much the progressive worldview. The government's responsible for all our problems. Here's why we should use the government to fix it. And I think that's very much the libertarian take on the issue. Next we have, Republicans push to strip Zohran Mamdani of U.S. citizenship. Is it possible? From AlJazeera.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, Republican lawmakers requested investigations into Mamdani's naturalization process and have called for stripping him of his United States citizenship and deporting him, accusing him without evidence of embracing communist and quote-unquote terrorist activities. And, yeah, personally, I don't really care for Mamdani, but I do think, stripping him of his citizenship is a little far. But, ultimately, those in positions of power can justify whatever they want to. It's very much why I don't care for democracy. It's simply tyranny of the majority. And you see that very much with Mamdani as well. Just because the majority of people in New York City elected him, or at least the majority of voters, I should say, not everyone voted. But, just since the majority of people elected him, that doesn't give him the right to do whatever he wants to in that city. Just like how, since it wasn't quite a majority, but, a plurality of voters elected President Trump, that doesn't give Trump the right to do whatever he wants to when it comes to being president in the United States. And it just goes to show you that, the libertarian position is, just because people can do something and they're in a position of authority doesn't mean that's going to be justified. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have how the Trump administration is giving even more tax breaks to the wealthy, from nytimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they said the Treasury Department and Internal Revenue Service are issuing rules that provide hundreds of billions of dollars in tax relief to big companies and the ultra-rich. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is you shouldn't have any taxes in the first place. if people want to pay taxes, I think they should be able to, but I don't think people should be forced to pay taxes if they don't want to. So with that being said, I'm glad that there's some tax relief, but I think it should be tax relief for everyone, not just big companies and the ultra rich. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have a democratic socialist dream. There is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, according to New York City Mayor-elect and Democratic Socialist and therefore anti-libertarian Zohran Mamdani in his victory speech, this new age will be defined by a competence and a compassion that have too long been placed at odds with one another. We will prove that there is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about. And then they added, a Washington Post editorial rightly points out that a thinking person might wonder whether it's good for the institution to have monopoly on violence since nothing is beyond its purview. And I'd agree with that, just because the government can do something doesn't mean it should. If people want to rely on the government to solve all their problems, ultimately people will just have to justify. So if they want to do that, that's fine. But, a lot of people, it's like you should try and be independent of the government as possible. If you can wipe your own ass, as I say, you should be able to wipe your own ass. If you want the government to wipe your ass, that's fine. If you want to have a federal agent come in and start wiping your ass, just by doing whatever you want to. And the people, but personally, I do think you should try and be dependent of the government as possible. And that's my independent of the government as possible, I should say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have editing federal employees' emails to blame Democrats for shutdown violated their First Amendment rights, judge says from CNN.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And they added, political officials are free to blame whomever they wish for the shutdown, but they cannot use rank-and-file civil servants as their unwilling spokespeople. The First Amendment stands in their way. The department's conduct therefore must cease. And yeah, personally, I could go either way here. When you apply for when you're working for someone, ultimately you're subject to their terms and conditions, and that includes whatever in your emails. They can edit them however they feel like. And yeah, ultimately, I do think you have a free speech argument here too. But the employer does have an ability to do whatever they want to a lot of the time, and that's important to remember as well, especially when you're looking at it from a libertarian perspective. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the bombshell inside Trump's $1.3 billion pardon market from Medium.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Mo Politics subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for, I think the president has too much pardon power, and I don't really care for Trump, pardoning people just because he has financial interest in them. But, look at Joe Biden. He was pardoning a lot of people on his side, like Dr. Fauci and his son Hunter. And, it just goes to show you, Reddit, they're arguing against pardons now, but when their side gets back in power, they'll say they're the greatest thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump. Administration says states must immediately undo any steps to send full SNAP benefits, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Prepper Intel subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for, people being dependent on government, but I think if people want to pay for SNAP and voluntarily and to provide food stamps for those less fortunate, I think they should be able to. But right now, I think the libertarian position is, since taxation is forced, people shouldn't be forced to pay taxes for whatever. In an ideal world, I would say taxation would be voluntary, and you could earmark where you want your taxes to go to. But right now, I would say the libertarian position is to get rid of taxation entirely, and that does include SNAP benefits. But yeah, ultimately, I do think, there's tons of things that the government should get rid of before they get rid of SNAP benefits, like foreign aid and the military and military spending. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have October layoffs were the worst in 22 years and hit tech workers hard. Under 53K in October 2025 from Gizmodo.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but that's the market sometimes. Sometimes you're going to lay off people, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's very much the nature of the free market, and the nature of freedom of association. Sometimes people will lay off people, and there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Argentine markets cheer Malay's election victory with massive rally from Reuters.com, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and they added, thank God the morons didn't win. And yeah, personally, I like Malay. He's probably I disagree with him on some issues. He's a pretty hardcore Zionist, so much that he even converted to Judaism. But, and I also don't like how, the U.S. is giving his country a lot of foreign aid right now. I don't think taxpayer dollars should be going to any foreign country. especially since people aren't consenting to where their taxpayer dollars go to in the first place. But yeah, personally, I'm glad that the market seems to like how he's winning. He's definitely better than the piranhas who came before him. But of course, Reddit, they really love economic left-wing populism like piranhas, and so of course they're gonna not like Malay because they're very blue-pilled like that. They'll do whatever the blue pill narrative says to do. Next, we have Palantir CEO says the surveillance state is preferable to China winning the AI race from Gizmodo.com, posted by Tom Furtain. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for China and its social credit system. But Palantir and private authoritarianism is important to remember as well. Just because the government isn't involved, doesn't mean private companies still can't be authoritarian. And this is a good example. Palantir is very much one of the current left-wing boogeymen, but I would argue it should be a boogeyman on all sides of the political spectrum. Just because you might agree with some of their positions doesn't mean a surveillance state is ever justified, whether it be public or private. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Texas asks judge for a restraining order against Tylenol maker to stop it from advertising that drug is safe. From abcnews.go.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for I guess Tylenols. I personally don't really care for all they're linking it to autism. If they want to link Tylenol to autism, that's they should be able to. But ultimately, I think the government should be out of advertising entirely. If they want, as I said previously, if they wanted to have Fred Flintstone tell me that Winston tastes good like a cigarette should, I think they should be able to. I think it's kind of scummy, like using cartoon characters to sell cigarettes. But ultimately, I do think a truly free market allows for false advertising. So even if you don't think Tylenol is safe, I think the truly free market is, if private companies should be able to advertise however they want, and it's up to you to discern the truth rather than have the government tell you what's true and what isn't. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Democrats fold on government shutdown from CNN.com, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and they added, shutting down the government to make it bigger is a real big brain move, LOL. And yeah, personally, I don't really care. I like the government shutdown. Personally, I think it was kind of false advertising because there's still stuff operating like police and public transit. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is we should shut down the government permanently, especially the federal government, because a lot of stuff right now is more run by the state governments than the federal government. I think we'd be completely fine getting rid of the federal government, splitting up into 50 different countries. Well, 51 if you count DC. And, well, you gotta add in the territories as well. But yeah, personally, it just goes to show you that, people overestimate its importance when you can shut the government down for 40 plus days and nothing really changes. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have, what's your biggest criticism of the beloved economist and social commentator Thomas Sowell, posted by Historical Donut 6758, and they added, go ahead and discuss. And yeah, I like Thomas Sowell. A lot of leftists completely ignore him since he kind of disregards their narrative, being a black conservative economist who's really, I think he's 100 soon in 2030. I think he was born in 1930. But I would say my biggest criticism is he does use the statist framework a lot, like a lot of people, and I think the libertarian perspective is you gotta break out of the statist framework and truly regard everything as free market, free association, all that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump orders all air traffic controllers back to work after shutdown deal, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crossed from the Fed employee subreddit, and that's a true from Donald Trump. All air traffic controllers must go back to work now. Anyone who doesn't will be substantially docked. For those air traffic controllers who were great patriots and don't take any time off for the Democrat shutdown hoax, I'll be recommending a bonus of $10,000 per person for distinguished service to our country. For those that did nothing but complain and took time off, even though everyone knew they would be paid in full shortly into the future, I am not happy with you. You didn't step to help the USA against the fake Democrat attack. He wrote that one. He wrote those in all caps. That was only meant to hurt our country. You'll have a negative mark, at least in my mind, against your record. If you want to leave service in the future, please do not hesitate to do so. If no payment or severance of any kind, you'll be quickly replaced by true patriots who will do a better job on the brand new state-of-the-art equipment, the best in the world. That we are in the process of ordering. The last administration wasted billions of dollars trying to fix antiquated junk. They had no idea what they were doing. Again, to our great American patriots, God bless you. I won't be able to send your money fast enough to all others. Report to work immediately. God bless America, President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, if he wants to justify doing all that, I think he should be able to, if air traffic controllers, if they want to justify not working or working, that's on them. It doesn't matter if there was a government shutdown or not. But yeah, personally, I don't really think anything's too bad from this from a libertarian perspective. If Trump wants to give a bonus for the air traffic controllers who worked through the shutdown, I think he should be able to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Even though, I guess that would be taxpayer dollars, I don't know if people will want taxpayer dollars going to people for something that Trump wants, but ultimately taxpayer dollars can go do whatever they want to. I personally think this is probably one of the better uses of them, I would say, if he does do the bonus for the people who work through the shutdown. Next, we have Supreme Court rejects Kim Davis's bid to overturn same-sex marriage from thehill.com, posted by Dr. Who 07. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the state being involved in marriage at all, but I do think, same-sex marriage should be on the same groundwork as, as a heterosexual marriage. People should be able to justify whatever they want to, and I think the libertarian position is, the problem is we have state involved in marriage at all. Marriage is very much a social and religious construct rather than a government one, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Ghislaine Maxwell's alleged prison perks spark Raskin probe into Trump administration from abcnews.go.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, looks like Trump's going to meet the sense of the second biggest pedophile in history. And yeah, personally, I don't think he should be doing that, but ultimately, both parties will cover for pedophiles if the narrative says to. I remember the left, they were pushing things when they were in power. They were pushing terms like minor attracted person for pedophiles who weren't actively offending, and that's very much how it is. Both major parties have pedophiles in them, but the people who are pushing stuff like maps are pretty much unquestionably on the left. I think that's important to remember as well. Both right will say, oh, we're anti-pedophiles, release the Epstein files. But then it's when there's an LGBTQ plus whatever other layers they've added as well, pedophile, they'll work their hardest to deflect from that and say, oh no, all pedophiles are on the right. Now, maybe, and then we'll also simultaneously saying, oh, some pedophiles might not offend, we should call them maps. And it just goes to show you that, they only just care who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group, especially when it comes to pedophiles. That's very much U.S. politics right now. It's your side is pedophiles, my side is perfect, and that's generally how it seems to be. Next, we have an encrypted group chat. National Guard members question Trump deployments. Posted from NPR.org, posted by an Ninja that's crossers from the NPR subreddit. And yeah, good personally, I'm glad that they're questioning Trump deployments. But with that being said, ultimately, if you're a National Guard member, you're going to be a foot soldier for the state. You might have to do things you don't want to. And sometimes that's what employment is. Sometimes when you have a job, you're going to do things that you don't want to do. And that's why it's called work rather than leisure or play. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump pledges to abide by deal to end government shutdown, but vows to uphold Obamacare subsidies, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's a Google link to the New York Post. Trump pledges to abide by deal to end government shutdown, and I think that's good. Personally, I think Obamacare is probably, or the Affordable Care Act, if you want to be less partisan, is kind of the worst of government run healthcare and the worst of private run healthcare put together. So I personally do think you should probably gut that as much as possible. And yeah, but of course Reddit, they love it because their guy passed it rather than the other guy. So of course that's Reddit. They'll love pretty much anything Obama does, even if they were super critical of anything of the office that he did in his term, like relentlessly bombing the Middle East, including a hospital. But now that Trump's in power, Obama's suddenly pretty much beyond criticism for Reddit, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Republicans sneak hemp products ban in the spending bill. 400,000 jobs will be lost from mjbiz.ly.com, posted by High on Goofballs. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for any products ban from a libertarian perspective, but ultimately, the government has a legal monopoly and supports justify doing whatever it feels like, and that does include a hemp products ban. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then we have another post I did to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, and I said, where should libertarians draw the lines in regards to victimless crimes? And I said, my general rule of thumb is that all parties involved are sound mind and it was consenting they should be able to do whatever they want, regardless of how moral or immoral they view the activity as. With that being said, you run into a few cases where the logic doesn't really hold up. Let's say someone digs up corpses from a local cemetery in order to sodomize them. In this instance, all parties are able to give consent for doing so, but it's obviously something that most libertarians still want to be illegal. That's obviously been an extreme example. You should always consider every scenario, in my opinion. thoughts. And, my thoughts on that are, ultimately I think people are going to just out there really just fine with it, regardless of the system they're going to replace. When it comes to dead bodies, you could argue that they're the property of the next of kin or the cemetery if it's privately owned. But, sometimes, people, maybe the cemetery's run down and abandoned, so maybe there will be no private ownership, but ultimately people are going to decide it's fine, even if it might be disgusting. Sometimes, you could argue, ultimately, it's a victimless crime if, personally, I don't really care if they sodomize my body after I'm dead, but, there's pretty much nothing I could do about it in that case. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.